Every generation is nostalgic for something they did as a kid. I watched a lot of cartoons as a child on a coincidental orange couch that my family just happened to own, and the show that seemed to be on the most was Rugrats. I remember when the original series ran, and was a teenager when the All Grown Up series debuted, so I spent a lot of time with the franchise. Today we're diving into a new game in the Rugrats series that is basically an NES platformer built in 2024. Let us dive right into it. Here is my review of Rugrats Adventures in Gameland for the Nintendo Switch. The story of this game revolves around Tommy, Chucky, Phil, and Lil seeing an advertisement on TV for a Reptar video game. Wanting to play it, they go on an adventure through their house using their own imagination to collect misplaced Reptar coins, hoping to open the Reptar-shaped door behind the TV and find what Tommy calls the Bibio game. As a story, it's kind of cute. The game has animated cutscenes built to look like the cartoon at the beginning and end, and has some baby talk with a few regular lines from the show from Protag Tommy. There's not really a lot to it, but since this is built like an NES game, it kind of makes sense for there to not be a lot of story here. Also, if you're wondering about the continuity of this game, I wouldn't even worry about it. This is a big nostalgia fest, and many of the references thrown around won't always play well with the characters that are seemingly missing, like the Reptar wagon being in one of the levels with no sign of Baby Dill. When it comes to gameplay, Gameland is a 2D platformer with light combat. As you trek through its 6 levels, you will platform and defeat enemies as you make your way to the level's boss fight. First off, this game is both an HD and 8-bit game all in one. At pretty much any time, you can go into settings or straight from the title screen thanks to a more recent patch and swap it between HD and 8-bit modes. It's kind of like the seamless graphic toggles in games like Halo Master Chief Collection, the Tomb Raider remasters, and Diablo 2 Resurrected. In 8-bit mode, you're still playing the same game, but it's built like an NES game, borders and all. And the reason for this is because it actually is an NES game. You'd be hard pressed to actually be able to buy it nowadays, but Limited Run Games actually released an NES cartridge version of Gameland that works on original NES hardware. The Steam PC release also includes an NES ROM for the game in its files. This is even included in the game's demo, so you can try the demo on an NES emulator before you buy the full game. Though it does seem like this is only the case for the Steam release. The Epic Game Store's version apparently does not include the NES ROM. Now on to main progression. This game is a 2D platformer where you're tasked in getting over 20 Reptar coins, collectibles from the game's 6 stages. These levels can be tackled in any order you want from the hub that is basically the Pickles House. Each one shows what boss will show up in it, letting you go through in any order. Trekking through each stage is a matter of platforming. You have many areas to go through and can start with any of the 4 playable baby characters of Tommy, Chucky, Phil, and Lil. They each have different strengths and stats with jumping and lifting abilities, with Chucky being the best jumper, having a very Luigi-style running extension to his jump, while Lil has a very Princess Peach-esque hover with her skirt. You can also use couch co-op to have someone grab an extra set of Joy-Cons to go through the levels together. Once you're in a stage, it's fairly straightforward. Each area has platforms for you to navigate, objects to use as climbing vines, and roaming enemies to avoid or defeat. Your goal is to find Reptar coins hidden around each stage and ultimately Tommy's handy screwdriver in order to open the baby gate at the end of the stage and tackle the boss to complete it. Many of this game's mechanics heavily remind me of the Super Mario series. You can jump around on platforms like pretty much any game of the genre, but many objects or sand pits can be thrown very much like what you can do in Super Mario Bros. 2. This includes some enemies that will be stunned when you jump on them. It also uses the airborne ground pound ability that was first seen in Yoshi's Island on the Super Nintendo as the main method of defeating enemies. Interestingly, or oddly, this game has a sort of vertical viewpoint to it. When playing in HD mode, you see the game screen zoomed in on the player to make it full screen. You can see everything from left to right, but part of the game above and below the player is concealed unless you look up and down. You can tap the ZR button to zoom out, giving the game the same sort of aspect ratio the 8-bit graphics have, showing you everything with borders on the sides. Possibly done to make the graphical toggle work while still letting the HD mode be full screen. Admittedly, it's a relatively simple game, but the difficulty is there. From the get-go, you get some tricky enemies like the gingerbread men in the fridge mission, or pretty much everything in the final level that makes it an approachable game, but you definitely need time to learn some parts of the stages to be able to get past them. If enemies jump at you from underneath, it's not like a Mario game where they just bounce off your boots and die. You get hit and take damage. You have to learn and move around everything. But funny enough, I found the actual bosses some of the simpler parts of the game. When you fight off the big baby, dummy bears, or Mr. Tippy, their patterns are pretty easy to predict. I did get hit a lot in each boss fight, but never had to repeat them to get through. But despite the difficulty, the game does have some nice features to rely on. As you go through each stage, you can find cookies that are basically auto revives, letting you keep going after losing all your health, refilling, and they can stack. A single baby can carry a few cookies at a time, and you can revisit levels to stack them up on each character to help give you even more revives. Tying that with the fact that you can swap characters mid-stage on the normal and easy difficulties when you get low on HP, and enemies endlessly respawn, allowing you to just farm an easy room to refill HP when it gets low. You have the tools to make this difficult game not so difficult. Though if you do happen to run out of characters, the game will boot you out in NES fashion. Losing everybody doesn't checkpoint you in the middle of the stage. It kicks you back to the title screen. Now this does feel a little dated when you play it, especially with how everything is designed with enemy patterns, respawning, and how exact you have to be for certain platforming to not get hit by enemy attacks. Though the developers did originally say they wanted to make something that felt like a game from long ago, and that definitely happened. But let's get back to what I said about Mr. Tippy and the Dummy Bears. This game is a gigantic nostalgia trip for Rugrats fans. Everything in it is a callback to the original animated series from the 90s, and a bunch of what it includes are fairly deep cuts and references that only appeared once in the entire show. Many of the bosses like Mr. Tippy and the Big Baby were one-offs, nightmare monsters that didn't show back up in the series after their initial debut. Pretty much all the enemies are also references, like the red parrot-like bird from the mystery episode, the floating Cynthia head from Angelica's doll, and some really out there stuff. The robotic cat that was in the show's intro but never actually showed up inside the show is an enemy here, as is the silver Dactar glider, clearly based not on the actual glider from the movie, but the Burger King toy from 1998. Anyways, as all of this comes together, we have an okay amount of content and length. You can beat the game without getting a few Reptar coins, and I managed to complete it without a guide in less than 2 hours. That might not be a lot if you bought the $60 NES game or even for the $25 digital version. But for a game that's mimicking the NES, that seems about right. There's no New Game Plus or anything like that. When you beat the game, you can just reload your last save to replay the final level or start over. Next up is presentation, which is beautiful. In HD mode, especially when zoomed in, everything looks absolutely perfect. Even the lines around everything is basically flawless, and the way the art is drawn makes it look like a cartoon and not some rendered model. The NES graphics look quite good as well, understandably without most of the background detail, but it still looks good for an NES game. When we get to performance, I don't have a lot of complaints. The game does have a pretty long initial loading sequence, but once you get into the game, you won't have any problems. The frame rate is, as you'd expect, right up at 60 FPS from start to finish. One thing I will note about performance is that there have been reports of different glitches in this game. One where the room flame level sends you to glitched versions of the first stage, and one specifically on Switch where the final level won't scroll to let you continue at a certain point. Thankfully, I didn't encounter either of these issues when I played through it on version 1.0.5, but it might be worth noting when you purchase. Next up is battery life, which surprisingly, you get the same amount regardless of whether you play 8-bit mode or HD. Gameland gives the original and the light models a battery range of about 4 to 5 hours, while the V2 and OLED models get 7 to 8 hours. In conclusion, Rugrats have come to the Switch in an interesting platformer built like an NES game, and actually is one thanks to limited run games. Now the downside, the game feels a bit janky at times and it isn't a very long adventure. Though if you go in and expect an NES game like the devs were going for, it's exactly what it's trying to be, jank and all. Reviews to go rates Rugrats Adventures in Gameland for the Nintendo Switch an 8 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching and have a great day.